Maggie Calloway hurled a 50-pound sack of feed across the warehouse floor so hard it split at the seam grain, scattering like broken promises across the boards. And she did not flinch. She did not apologize. She pressed her boot heel into the mess and looked the man standing in her doorway dead in the eye. The man who had just told the entire town of Red Bluff that no woman who worked like a mule deserved to be loved like a lady. "You're standing in my store," she said, "so either buy something or get out." If you've ever been told you were too much subscribed to this channel right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the end. This one is for every woman who was called too strong before someone finally called her exactly right. The sack had been the third one that morning. Maggie Calloway didn't count them by weight anymore. She counted them by the ache that settled between her shoulder blades around noon, the one she never complained about, the one she stretched out each night in the back room of the Calloway feed store after she'd locked the front door and pulled the ledger open and started doing the math that nobody had taught her. She'd taught herself, column by column, dollar by dollar, the way she'd taught herself most things in life, alone by lamplight, with nobody watching and nobody helping, and nobody there to tell her she was doing it wrong. That was the fall of 1883 in Red Bluff, Texas. And Maggie Calloway was 28 years old and had been running that store for 6 years, since her father's hands had stopped working well enough to manage the accounts, and her two brothers had decided that cattle country farther west suited them better than staying to help their sister keep the family name off a creditor's list. She didn't hate them for it. She just got stronger. Red Bluff wasn't a cruel town exactly. It wasn't the kind of place where people gathered in the street to say ugly things out loud. It was more subtle than that. It was the way Martha Hensley from the dry goods shop would watch Maggie load her own wagon and click her tongue soft enough that you almost couldn't hear it. It was the way the men at the saloon on Friday evenings would go quiet for just a half second when Maggie walked past the open door and then start up again, a little louder than before. It was Bill Harmon who ran the livery stable and fancied himself something of an authority on most things, saying within earshot of 3 or 4 people at the general store. One Tuesday morning, "Woman's capable as any man in the county." Shame, that's exactly the problem. Maggie had heard him. She always heard them. She just never gave them the satisfaction of knowing it. She had been proposed to twice. The first time was Thomas Greer, a farmer from the south end of the county, decent enough man, soft hands, nervous around horses. He'd come into the store on a Wednesday and bought a bag of oats he didn't need, and then stood there turning his hat in his hands for so long that Maggie had finally set down her pencil and looked at him straight. "Thomas," she said, "say whatever it is you came to say." He said it. He said he'd been thinking about it for some time, and he thought they might suit each other, and he had a good piece of land and a solid house, and he could offer her a comfortable life. Maggie had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas, you're a good man, but you don't want a wife. You want someone to cook for you and look soft in your parlor. I don't do either of those things particularly well." He'd nodded and walked out, and that had been the end of it. The second time was Robert Finch, who was better looking than Thomas, and knew it, which was most of his problem. He'd lasted longer in conversation. He'd even made her laugh once, which was no small thing. But then one evening, he'd told her with the particular confidence of a man who thought he was paying a compliment that once they were married, she wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. She'd looked at him for a long moment. "Robert," she said slowly, the way you talk to someone who has just said something that requires careful processing before you respond. "Working hard is not the problem I'm trying to escape. It's the thing I'm most proud of." He'd stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. And that was when she knew that whatever they were building had no foundation at all. After Robert Finch, Maggie stopped considering it. Not out of bitterness, out of practicality. She had a store to run, and accounts to keep and feed to haul, and she decided that a woman could build a full life without a man in it if the alternative was shrinking herself down to fit into a space that was too small for her. Red Bluff seemed to agree that she was right, though not the way she meant it. That October morning started like most of them. Cold air coming in under the warehouse door. Coffee she'd made before dawn half gone, and lukewarm by the time she got to it. 3 deliveries before 9 in the morning, and the third one was the sack that split. She was still on her knees sweeping grain into a pile when she heard boots on the porch. Heavy, measured. The kind of walk that didn't hurry and didn't drag. She didn't look up right away. She finished sweeping what she could into the dustpan, pressed her fists into the small of her back, and then turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand. 35 maybe, with the look of a man who had worked outside long enough that the weather had settled permanently into the lines of his face. Not handsome in the soft way Robert Finch had been. More like a landscape was handsome, the kind of face that had been shaped by something real. Dark eyes steady, a jaw that looked like it had made a few decisions and stuck to them. "Ma'am," he said. "Store's open," Maggie said. "What do you need?" "I'm Cole Bridger," he said. "Just took the foreman position out at the McCready Ranch. Came in to set up a feed account if that's something you do." "It is," she said. She moved behind the counter, pulled out the account ledger, opened it to a clean page. "McCready hasn't had an account here in about 4 years. They were buying from the Hutchins brothers' supply out of Dalton." "I know," Cole said. He came to the counter not all the way, left a respectful distance between himself and the edge. "The Hutchins brothers aren't in business anymore, and I drove past your store coming into town. Figured I'd start here." Maggie looked down at the ledger, wrote the date, wrote McCready. Ranch wrote Cole Bridger foreman. "I'll need a deposit to open the account. $20, monthly terms. That's fair." He reached into his coat without any fuss and laid 2 $10 gold pieces on the counter. She didn't look at the money right away. She wrote the deposit into the ledger first, recorded it, drew the line under it the way she always did. Then she looked up. "What's your monthly feed need likely to run?" He gave her a number. A real number, not an estimate broken down by stock count feed type projected winter increase. She wrote it down and felt without entirely meaning to a small flicker of something she didn't immediately name. Most men who came in gave her a rough figure and expected her to sort out the details. This one had already sorted them. "You manage the accounts at McCready yourself?" she asked. "Part of my job," he said. "Rather know the exact numbers than guess at them." "Smart," she said. It came out before she decided to say it. She looked back down at the ledger. "I'll have your first order ready by Friday. You want it delivered or you picking up?" "I'll send a hand to pick it up." He put his hat back on, adjusted it once. "Thank you, ma'am." "Calloway," she said. "Maggie Calloway, Miss Calloway." He nodded, turned and walked back out the door, the same way he'd walked in, measured, unhurried, like a man who had somewhere to be and no need to rush to get there. Maggie stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone. Then she went back to finish sweeping up the grain. He came back on Friday himself, not a ranch hand. She didn't comment on it. She had the McCready order loaded and ready, and he helped move the heavier sacks without being asked, and without making a show of it the way some men did when they helped a woman lift something like they expected to be thanked twice. He just lifted the sack and moved it, and that was that. "Order's right," he said, checking it against the slip she'd given him. "It always is," she said. He looked at her when she said it. Not in the way men sometimes looked at her when she said something direct, that brief flinching recalibration, that split second, where they weren't sure whether to laugh or take offense. He just looked at her like she'd said something that made complete sense and nodded. "I expect it is," he said. He came back the following Tuesday. No order due. She was in the middle of reconciling the month's accounts when she heard those boots on the porch again, and something in her recognized the sound before she'd consciously identified it. He said he had a question about the billing terms for winter pre-orders. It was a reasonable question. She answered it. He asked a follow-up question, also reasonable. They spent 20 minutes at the counter with the ledger open between them, and she explained how she structured the pre-order discount, and he listened. The way people listened when they were actually interested, and not just waiting for you to finish. When he left the second time, Bill Harmon was standing across the street. Maggie saw him from the window. Saw him watching Cole walk back to his horse. saw him say something to the man beside him, and saw the other man laugh. She knew what they were saying. She always knew. She went back to her ledger. He came back Thursday. This time he didn't pretend it was business. He bought a single bag of grain he absolutely did not need for a ranch the size of McCready and set it on the counter between them, like an admission of something. "You work every day?" he asked. "Stores open 6 days," she said. "Closed Sundays." "You ever walk along the river?" She looked at him. "Not usually during business hours." He almost smiled. It was a restrained thing, barely there like most of what he did. "I meant generally." "Sometimes," she said, "when the accounts are done." He nodded, picked up his single bag of grain. "Good to know," he said, and left. Martha Hensley came in an hour later for her weekly order of straw and spent approximately 12 minutes longer than necessary asking questions that weren't about straw. Maggie answered the straw questions and let the other ones go unanswered, and Martha eventually left, looking mildly frustrated. That afternoon, while Maggie was entering the week's final figures into the ledger, Bill Harmon came in. He didn't buy anything. He leaned on the counter the way men leaned on things when they were about to say something you hadn't asked for. "Saw Cole Bridger coming out of your store again," he said. "He has an account here," Maggie said without looking up. "That right." Bill was quiet for a moment. "He seems like a decent enough fella. Just I'd hate to see him get a wrong idea." Maggie set her pencil down. She looked up slowly. "What idea would that be, Bill?" "Well..." Bill shifted his weight. "You know how you are, Maggie. You're a lot. And most men, they come in thinking they can handle it, and then they realize it's more than they bargained for." She let the silence sit between them for long enough that Bill started to look uncomfortable. "Bill," she said finally, "I appreciate your concern. I really do. Now, are you buying something today, or are you just stopping by to let me know what you think?" Bill bought a sack of oats he probably didn't need either, and left without saying much else. Maggie looked at the closed door after he'd gone. More than they bargained for. She'd heard that her whole life in one form or another. Said by people who meant it kindly even. People who thought they were explaining something useful. As if the problem was her size, her directness, her refusal to make herself smaller in rooms that felt too tight. As if the solution was simply to want less, be less, take up less space. She'd tried that once when she was young enough to believe it might work. She'd tried being quieter. She'd tried letting other people's answers stand even when she knew they were wrong. She'd tried asking for help she didn't need just to give men the satisfaction of providing it. It had lasted about 3 weeks. And then she'd gone back to being herself, because the other version of her was a stranger she didn't want to live with. She picked her pencil back up and went back to the accounts. That evening, after she'd locked the front door and the town had settled into its Friday night noise, the saloon down the street, a few horses on the main road, the distant sound of somebody's guitar going at it enthusiastically, if not particularly well, Maggie sat at the back table with the ledger and the lamp and worked through the figures until they balanced. They always balanced. She made sure of it. She thought about Cole Bridger the way you think about something when you're trying not to think about it, which means you think about it constantly. The way he'd broken down the feed numbers before she asked. The way he'd lifted that sack without making it a performance. The way he'd looked at her when she said the order was always right, like that was simply a thing he expected to be true. She was 35. He was older than Thomas Greer and more composed than Robert Finch. He had a foreman's job at a respectable ranch and seemed to understand numbers and didn't waste words on things that didn't need words. None of that meant anything, she told herself. She closed the ledger, turned the lamp down, sat in the dark for a moment with her hands flat on the table. She'd spent 6 years building something real in this town. 6 years making the Calloway name mean something on Main Street. She didn't need it complicated by a man with measured boots and careful eyes who bought grain he didn't need on a Thursday afternoon. She went to bed. She lay there for a long time not sleeping. Saturday morning she opened the store at 7, and by 8:30 she had loaded 2 orders, argued gently with a rancher about a billing error that was his fault and not hers, and made a fresh pot of coffee, that she actually got to drink while it was still hot, which felt like an accomplishment. At 9:15, she heard those boots on the porch. She didn't look up from the counter. "Store's open," she said. "I know," Cole Bridger said. "I saw the sign." She looked up then. He was standing in the doorway again, with his hat in his hand again, and there was something different in his face. This time, not a performance of confidence, not the careful, business-like expression he'd worn during the account conversation. Something more direct than that. Something that looked, she thought, a lot like a man who had made a decision and was standing on the far side of it. "I don't have a business reason for being here today," he said. "I know," she said. He came to the counter. "I'd like to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Would you walk with me this evening along the river? No business." He paused. "I'd just like to talk with you." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the counter was still lit from the early gray morning, and it threw a warm line of light across the ledger, and behind Cole, she could see through the window that the town was already awake and moving. She thought about Bill Harmon's voice. A lot. More than they bargained for. She thought about Thomas Greer's nervous hands, Robert Finch's comfortable life. She thought about 6 years of this ledger, and this lamp, and this store, and herself alone with it. "What time?" she said. Cole Bridger did not smile the way most men smiled when they thought they'd won something. He just nodded once, like a man accepting a responsibility. "Sunset," he said. "I'll meet you at the south end of Calloway Street, where the road bends toward the water." "I'll be there," she said. He put his hat back on. "Thank you, Miss Calloway." "Maggie," she said. He paused at the door, looked back at her with those steady dark eyes. "Maggie," he said, and walked out. She stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone, the same way she had the very first time. Then she picked up her pencil and opened the ledger and began to work through the morning's figures. But the numbers took longer than usual to balance that day. For the first time in a very long while, Maggie Calloway's mind was somewhere other than the column in front of her. The sun was already low by the time Maggie locked the front door of the feed store that evening. She didn't change her dress. She considered it for about 4 seconds, standing in the back room with her hand on the hook where her better blouse hung, and then she took her hand back. She wasn't going to a dance. She wasn't trying to be something she wasn't. Cole Bridger had asked to walk with the woman who ran the Calloway feed store, and that was the woman who was going to show up. She washed her face and hands, pinned back the strands of hair that had come loose during the day, and walked out. The south end of Calloway Street, where the road bent toward the river, was maybe 4 minutes from the store. She walked it at her regular pace, not slow, not hurried, and when she turned the bend, he was already there. He was standing with his back to her, looking out toward the water hat in his hands, the way he always seemed to hold it when he wasn't working. He turned before she said anything, like he'd heard her footsteps and already knew them. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. He nodded like that settled something, and fell into step beside her without ceremony. They walked in silence for the first few minutes, and it wasn't uncomfortable the way silence usually was with people who didn't know each other well. It was the kind of quiet that came when two people had already decided they were going to speak honestly and were just choosing where to start. Cole started. "How long have you been running the store alone?" he asked. 6 years, she said, "since my father's hands gave out. My brothers went west." "They help at all, the brothers." "With letters." She said it plainly without bitterness. "They write good letters." Cole was quiet a moment. "That's a hard thing to carry alone." "You get used to the weight," she said. "Same as anything." He looked at her sideways when she said it. Not the pitying look she sometimes got when people realized the scope of what she managed alone, the look that made her feel like a cautionary tale. This was something else. More like recognition. "Where were you before McCready?" she asked. "Montana," he said. 7 years on a cattle spread outside of Billings. Before that, Colorado. I've moved around." "What made you stop moving?" He thought about it before he answered, which she was already starting to understand was simply how he operated. He didn't fill silence with the first words that came. "I started wanting something that stayed put," he said. "A place that meant something. Work you could point to and say that's mine. I built that." "McCready's not yours," she said. "Not yet," he said, and the way he said it made her glance at him. He was looking straight ahead. A good foreman builds something worth having. That's the first step. She thought about that. She understood the logic of it, the long game, the slow build toward something real. She'd been playing it herself for 6 years with the feed store accounts. "The town's been talking," she said. She didn't soften it. "I know," he said. "Bill Harmon came in yesterday." Cole looked at her then. "What did he say?" "What he always says." She kept her voice even. "That I'm a lot. That men who come around end up realizing I'm more than they bargained for." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she realized he'd stopped, and she turned to look at him. "Bill Harmon." Cole said carefully, like he was choosing each word from a selection, "runs a livery stable. Not particularly well from what I've seen. I don't reckon his opinion on what a man can handle carries much weight." She looked at him. "You've been in town 3 weeks. Long enough to watch," he said. "And what I've watched is a woman who runs her store and her accounts and her life with more sense and more spine than half the men in this county combined. The problem isn't you, Maggie. The problem is men who want a woman to be easy." The word landed differently than she expected. Not comfortable, not smooth, real. She turned and started walking again. After a moment he caught up. "2 men proposed to me," she said. "Both of them ended up wanting the same thing Robert Finch wanted. They wanted me less." "What's wrong with what you are?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "According to me." "According to me either," he said. "For what that's worth." They reached the bend in the river where a stand of cottonwoods grew close together, and the last of the light was coming through the branches in long, thin pieces. She stopped there because it was a natural place to stop, not for any other reason. "You don't know me," she said. She turned to face him. "You've been in my store 6 times, and you've asked me sensible questions about billing terms, and you've helped move feed without making it a production. That's not knowing someone." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "So what are you doing, Cole?" He held her gaze without flinching. "Starting," he said, "if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. The river moved behind him, and the cottonwoods moved, and everything in Maggie Calloway that had been locked down tight for 6 careful years shifted, not broke, not gave way, shifted. Like something that had been fixed in place for so long, it had forgotten it was capable of movement. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know that," he said. "I won't be less than I am. I'm not asking you to be." "Men say that," she said. "And then they stand in my store and look at my account ledger and decide they'd feel better if I let them handle the numbers." Something crossed his face. Not offense. Something more like he'd just been handed a piece of information he intended to keep. "My mother ran a dry goods store in Kansas for 11 years after my father died," he said. "She did every account herself. Raised 4 kids in the back room. Nobody gave her any help and nobody gave her any credit, and she was the sharpest woman I've ever known." He paused. "Until recently." The last 2 words were quiet. Barely there. She almost didn't catch them. She looked away toward the water. "That's a good thing to say," she said. "It's a true thing," he said. "I don't say things that aren't." They stood there in the near dark for a little while, not speaking. The kind of silence that had weight and warmth to it, the kind that meant something different now than it had an hour ago. "I should get back," she finally said. "I'll walk you." They turned back toward town. Partway along the road, Cole said without looking at her, "Same time next week." She considered it the way she considered everything straight on, without the pretense of indecision she didn't actually feel. "Maybe Thursday," she said. He almost smiled. She was starting to be able to read the almost smile now. It was the slight deepening of one line at the corner of his mouth, the barely there shift in his eyes. "Thursday," he said. She left him at the bend and walked back toward Calloway Street alone, and the town was lit up and noisy in its Saturday night way, and Maggie walked through it with her spine straight and her head up the way she always did. But something was different, and she knew it, and she didn't try to pretend otherwise. She just didn't yet know what to do with it. Thursday came faster than she expected, partly because the week was busy, in the way that October weeks always were, ranchers pre-ordering winter feed accounts that needed adjusting a discrepancy in a delivery from the Dalton supplier that took her 2 days of correspondence to resolve in her favor. By Thursday afternoon, she had worked 11 hours without pause, and her shoulders ached, and the coffee pot was empty, and she still had to reconcile the week's figures before she could leave. She finished them at 5:30, locked the door, walked to the river. He was already there. "You look like you've had a long week," he said when she reached him. "Don't I always?" she said. "You're different today," he said. "Supplier tried to short me on a delivery. Took 2 days to straighten out." "You straighten it out." "Of course I did." She said it the way she said things that didn't require further explanation. "Of course you did." He said the same way, like an echo that agreed with itself. They walked. The October cold had deepened since Saturday, and the river smell was sharper, cleaner, the way cold air made everything more distinct. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why haven't you married?" He didn't hesitate. "Came close once. Woman in Montana, Clara. Smart, good person. We wanted different things, and we both knew it, and neither one of us was willing to say it out loud for about 6 months longer than we should have." He paused. "When we finally said it, she cried, and I felt like the lowest kind of man alive. But staying when it wasn't right would have been worse." "What did you want that she didn't?" "She wanted settled, comfortable," he said. "A house that didn't need fixing. A man who came home at the same time every night. There's nothing wrong with that." He looked at the path ahead. "What she wanted wasn't what I had to offer." "And what do you have to offer?" Maggie asked. It was a direct question, and she knew it, and she asked it anyway. He was quiet for a few steps. "Steadiness," he said. "Not the comfortable kind. The kind that doesn't leave. The kind that shows up on the hard days and doesn't need to be asked." Another pause. "And I listen. Most men don't. I've noticed that about myself. I listen better than I talk, and I think that's more valuable than most people give it credit for." She thought about Thomas Greer, who had talked at her through most of their acquaintance and never once seemed curious about what she thought. She thought about Robert Finch, who had listened, but only to the parts he agreed with, and had a particular selective deafness for everything else. "You're right," she said. "It's more valuable." They walked to the far Cottonwood Bend and turned back. Halfway to town, Cole said, "Martha Hensley stopped me on Main Street this morning." Maggie closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "What did she say?" "She said she hoped I knew what I was getting into." He kept walking, kept his voice the same flat, even tone. "She said you were difficult and strong-minded, and she meant it as a warning. And I told her I was grateful she'd saved me the trouble of figuring it out on my own." He paused. "She didn't seem to know what to do with that." Maggie laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, how sudden it was, how real. She hadn't laughed like that in a while. Not the polite social kind of laugh she deployed in business conversations, but the actual involuntary kind that came from somewhere you didn't manage. Cole looked at her when she laughed, and the almost smile became something more than that. Not a full grin, nothing theatrical, just a softening of his whole face like a knot coming loose. "You should do that more," he said. "Mind your business," she said, but she was still smiling, and they both knew it. When they reached the bend near town, he stopped. She stopped with him. "Maggie," he said. "Cole, I want to be straight with you about something." She waited. "I'm not here because I want to prove something," he said. "I'm not here because I think you need fixing or saving, or somebody to take the weight off your hands." I'm here because you're the most interesting person I've met in a very long time, and I'd like to keep knowing you better." He held her gaze. That's all. No other agenda. She looked at him for a long moment, with the wind coming off the river behind them, and the lights of Red Bluff visible above the tree line, and the sound of the town going on without them. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She started toward town. 2 steps out, she stopped and turned back. "Same time Saturday," she said. The full, not quite smile. The deepened line. The barely there shift. "Saturday," he said. She walked back to the store and let herself in the rear door and stood in the back room in the dark for a moment, with her hand still on the door handle. Her heart was doing something it had not done in a very long time, not racing, not fluttering, none of that foolishness. Just beating a little more deliberately than usual, like it had noticed something. She let go of the door, lit the lamp, sat down at the table. She didn't open the ledger. For the first time in 6 years, the accounts could wait until morning. But Saturday didn't go the way she expected, because Saturday morning, before she'd even unlocked the front door, she found Bill Harmon sitting on her porch steps with the expression of a man who believed he was about to do someone a very large favor. She stopped in front of him. "Bill." "Morning, Maggie." He stood up, held his hat. "I was hoping to catch you before you opened." "You've caught me," she said. "What do you need?" "I wanted to talk to you about Cole Bridger." She didn't react. "Bill, I've got deliveries in an hour." "I know. This won't take long." He shifted his weight. "I've been asking around. Bridger's been through a lot of towns. Montana, Colorado, 2 other places before that. Never stays more than a year or 2. She looked at him. "He's a foreman. Foremen move when work moves." "Maybe," Bill said. "But I talked to a man who worked with him up in Montana. He said Bridger had a woman up there. Said he left without much warning." She held very still. "He didn't leave," she said quietly. "It didn't work out. There's a difference." Bill blinked. "You knew about the Montana woman." "He told me about her himself," she said. First conversation. That took the certainty out of Bill's expression. He scrambled for another foothold. "Well, still, Maggie, a man who moves around like that." "Bill." She stepped past him to the door, fit the key to the lock, turned it. "I appreciate that you're trying to look out for me. I do. But I'm 28 years old, and I've been running this business alone for 6 years, and I think I'm capable of deciding for myself who is and isn't worth knowing." She pushed the door open. "Now, you want to come in and buy something this morning, or shall we call this done?" He bought oats again. He always bought oats he didn't need. It was practically a nervous habit at this point. After he left, Maggie stood at the counter and looked at the door. Bill wasn't malicious. She understood that. He was the kind of man who'd built his whole sense of the world on knowing how things worked, and she was a variable he'd never quite managed to categorize. A woman without a husband who ran a business and kept her own accounts and refused to pretend she needed help. She didn't need, she disrupted something in his understanding of how things ought to be, and that disruption looked like concern when he talked about it, but felt like something else underneath. She thought about what Cole had told her. The woman in Montana. How he'd said it plainly without defense, without trying to make himself look better than the facts allowed. When she'd stayed with a man who wasn't right rather than saying it out loud, she thought about Thomas Greer and his nervous hands, about Robert Finch and his comfortable life. And then she thought about the way Cole Bridger had said, "It's more valuable," just like that, without calculation, without performing the sentiment. She opened the ledger and began the morning's work. That evening, when he appeared at the bend near the river, she told him about Bill Harmon's visit. All of it. The Montana conversation, the leaving without warning, the look on Bill's face when she told him she already knew. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He wasn't entirely wrong about the leaving." She looked at him sharply. "I left Montana faster than I should have," he said. "Clara and I had a hard last month, And I got my job offer from Colorado, and I took it 2 weeks earlier than I'd planned. I told myself it was just the timing." He paused. "I've thought about that since. It wasn't my best moment." She held that. Let it sit. "Why are you telling me that?" she asked. "Because you told me about Bill," he said. "And because you deserve the actual story, not the version I'd tell someone who was already deciding whether to trust me." The wind moved through the cottonwoods. The river went on. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I said all right," she said. "Are we walking, or are we standing here?" He looked at her for one more beat, and then he turned and they walked, and the town went on behind them with its lamps and its noise and its opinions, and for once, Maggie Calloway didn't hear any of it. She was listening to something else entirely. The week between Saturday and the following Thursday was the longest Maggie had felt in recent memory, and she knew exactly why, and she did not appreciate knowing exactly why. She appreciated precision in most things. She appreciated knowing the exact weight of a feed sack, the exact dollar figure in her accounts, the exact nature of a problem before she set about solving it. But this particular precision, the sharp, clear awareness that she was counting days until she walked to the river again, felt like something she hadn't agreed to. She threw herself into work the way she always did when something needed managing. Monday, she reorganized the back warehouse inventory and found a billing discrepancy from the previous month that had been sitting quietly wrong for 30 days. She corrected it with 3 letters and a firmly worded accounting note, and felt the satisfaction of a thing made right. Tuesday, she took on a new account, the Delgado family from the east end of the county small ranch, reliable people, and spent an hour going over their first order with the kind of care she gave every new account regardless of size. Wednesday, she fixed a broken hinge on the warehouse door herself with a screwdriver and her own 2 hands. And when old Frank Pruitt from the hardware store walked past and offered to send his boy over to help, she told him pleasantly that she had it handled. She always had it handled. But Thursday evening, she walked to the river and Cole was already there, and the relief she felt when she saw him standing there with his hat in his hands was so immediate and so undeniable that it scared her, and she spent the first 10 minutes of their walk being slightly more businesslike than she needed to be just to put some distance between herself and that feeling. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You're different tonight," he said. "Long week," she said. "Same thing you said last Thursday." "It was a long week last Thursday, too." He let it sit for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to come if you don't want to, Maggie." She stopped walking, turned to look at him. "I want to come," she said. He met her eyes. "All right. I just—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not accustomed to wanting things I can't account for." He turned that over. She could see him doing it. "What does that mean?" "It means I can tell you the exact profit margin of the Calloway feed store for the last 6 years, she said. "I can tell you which accounts are reliable and which ones need watching, and exactly how much buffer I need in the operating fund to survive a bad winter. I'm comfortable with what I can measure." She paused. "This doesn't measure." Cole was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "That bothers me," she said. "I know," he said. "Does it bother you enough to stop?" She looked at him. The river moved. The cottonwoods moved. "No," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then let's walk." They walked, and the distance she'd put between herself and the feeling closed back up on its own without her doing anything about it at all. November came in cold and deliberate, the way it did in Red Bluff, not sudden, just inevitable. The town pulled its coat a little tighter, and the ranchers started talking about winter stores, and Maggie's accounts expanded with pre-orders, and the feed store became, for 3 or 4 weeks, the busiest it was all year. She barely had time to think, which was on balance probably useful. Cole came in twice that first week of November on actual business. The McCready winter pre-order was substantial, and took 3 separate conversations to finalize, and each time he came in, there was that same exchange beneath the professional one. the ledger open between them. His questions precise and practical, her answers the same. And underneath all of it, the thing neither of them named while they were standing in the store in full view of anyone who happened to walk past the front window. Martha Hensley happened to walk past the front window both times. On the second occasion, she didn't even pretend she was going somewhere. She just stopped directly in front of the window and looked in, and then moved on. Cole watched her go without expression. Then he looked back at Maggie. "Does that bother you?" he asked. "Not particularly," Maggie said. "Martha's been watching me for 6 years. She watched me the day I took over the accounts from my father. She watched me the day I turned down Thomas Greer. She watched me the day I fixed the warehouse door hinge. She drew the line under the final figure on the McCready order sheet. I reckon at this point she's entitled to watch. She's put in the time." Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh contained before it got all the way out. "She cornered me at the feed store Thursday morning," he said. Maggie looked up. "Martha said she wanted to give me some friendly advice." His voice was entirely neutral. "Said that Maggie Calloway was a fine woman, but set in her ways and not likely to change, and a man who was serious about settling down ought to consider whether that was something he could live with long term." Maggie set the pencil down. "And what did you say?" she asked. "I said I'd consider it." He picked up his copy of the order sheet, folded it once with the same precise economy he applied to everything. Then I considered it for about 4 seconds and decided Martha Hensley had confused "set in her ways" with "knows who she is," and that I didn't see those as the same thing at all. Maggie looked at him across the counter for a long moment. "Cole," she said. "Maggie, you can't keep—" She stopped. "Every time someone in this town says something about me, you come in here and say exactly the right thing in response. It's starting to feel like you're doing it on purpose." "I am doing it on purpose," he said without any defensiveness at all. She stared at him. "I mean what I say," he said. "That's all. I'm not performing it." He met her eyes steadily. "You want me to stop telling you?" She picked up the pencil. "No," she said. He picked up his hat. "Friday for pickup." "Friday," she said. He was at the door when she said, without entirely planning to, "She's not wrong, you know, about the set in my ways part." He turned back, looked at her. "I know that," he said. "I'm counting on it." He left. She looked at the door for 3 full seconds. Then she opened the ledger and started the next entry, and did not think about Cole Bridger for the rest of the afternoon, except continuously. The twist came on a Wednesday evening in the second week of November, and it came from a direction Maggie had not anticipated. She was closing up accounts' balanced lamp turned low, about to pull her coat from the hook, when the door opened. She hadn't locked it yet. She turned around expecting a last-minute customer. It was Robert Finch. She hadn't seen him in 2 years. He'd moved to Abilene after their conversation had ended badly, and she'd assumed with some relief that Abilene was where he'd stayed. Apparently not. He looked the same, better dressed if anything. The particular confidence that was mostly about his face hadn't diminished any. "Maggie," he said. He smiled. "You look well." She didn't move from where she was standing. "Robert, store's closing." "I know. I waited." He came in, closed the door behind him, and that told her everything about how he'd decided this conversation was going to go, that he had rights to the space, that she would not dismiss him. She remained where she was and let him have the illusion. "I'm back in the county," he said. "Bought the Whitmore property on the North Road. I'm going to run cattle." He paused, and she could see him deciding on an approach. "I heard some things. About you and that McCready foreman. People talk," she said. "Maggie." He came a few steps closer. The particular tone men used when they were framing something selfish as something generous started to coat his voice. "I made a mistake. 2 years ago I said something stupid, and I know it. You shouldn't have to." He gestured vaguely. "A woman like you with a man who's just passing through." "Robert," she said. He stopped. Cole Bridger is not passing through. She kept her voice completely level. And even if he were, that's a conversation between him and me, not between you and me. You don't know him, Robert said. You've known him a few weeks. I've known you for 3 years. You knew the version of me that fit into your idea of a wife, she said. That's not the same thing. He flushed. The confidence on his face shifted into something less comfortable. I'm just saying you should be careful. I'm always careful, she said. It's one of my better qualities. Good night, Robert. He didn't move immediately. She saw him wanting to say one more thing, cycling through options. I came back partly because of you, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. And she felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the cold clarity she usually felt in difficult conversations. She felt something closer to pity. Because she could see clearly what Robert Finch was standing in her doorway, in his good clothes, with his purchased cattle property. He was a man who had only wanted her when someone else was about to have her. Robert, she said quietly, you came back because you heard I was seeing someone, and you don't like the thought of it. That's not the same as caring about me. She moved to the door and held it open. I hope the cattle work out. He left. She locked the door. She stood in the store for a moment in the lamplight, with her hand on the lock, and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle through her. Not painful exactly, more like confirmation, like something she'd half known for 2 years had finally been said out loud, clearly enough to become fact. She was done with what Robert Finch represented. She had been for a long time. She pulled on her coat and walked out the back. She told Cole about it on Thursday. She hadn't planned to tell him. She'd started the walk intending to say nothing. It was a closed matter. She'd handled it. It didn't require further review. But they were 10 minutes in, and the river was moving, and the cold was sharp and real, and Cole was listening the way he listened with his full attention, and she heard herself say it anyway. She told him all of it. The door opening, Robert's rehearsed opening, the cattle property, and the particular flavor of his concern, and what she'd said to him when he told her he'd come back partly because of her. Cole listened without speaking until she was done. Then he said, "What did you feel when you said that to him?" She thought about it. "Clear," she said, "like a ledger that finally balanced." "That's a good feeling," he said. "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maggie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." She looked at him. "When have I answered anything crooked?" The almost smile. Then it went serious again. "Do you trust me?" She didn't answer immediately. Not because she was uncertain, but because the question deserved the same precision she gave everything else. "I trust what I've seen," she said. "You say what you mean. You don't make promises you can't keep. You told me something unflattering about Montana when you didn't have to. You listen." She paused. "That's more than most people give me reason to trust." "But," he said. He'd heard the unfinished edge. "But I've been wrong before," she said, "about what people meant when they said things. Thomas meant well and still wanted something I wasn't. Robert was convincing for longer than he should have been." She looked at the path ahead. "I've learned to watch what people do over time, not just what they say at the river in November." "That's fair," he said. "I know it is," she said. "Then I'll give you time," he said, simply, without negotiation. "And you watch what I do." Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in his company, that deliberate weighty beat, that aware of itself rhythm that she still hadn't fully categorized. "All right," she said. They walked on. The cold came off the water, and she pulled her coat tighter, and without any discussion of it, Cole moved slightly closer so that the warmth of him was there at her shoulder, a presence without presumption, near enough to matter, and not so near as to assume. She didn't step away. They walked like that for a while, her shoulder near his arm, the river beside them, the November dark coming in, thick and early, the way it did that time of year in Texas. And Maggie Calloway, who had spent 6 years being precisely the right distance from everyone in her life, stayed exactly where she was. The following Saturday changed everything. She was in the back of the warehouse inventorying the winter stock when she heard raised voices in the front of the store. That in itself wasn't unusual. Ranchers argued, delivery men argued Bill. Harmon occasionally argued with himself about the price of oats and then bought them anyway. But she recognized one of the voices. She came through the warehouse door into the front of the store and stopped. Cole was standing at the counter. Across from him was Gerald McCready himself, the ranch owner, 62 years old big man, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being the loudest in any room. And Gerald McCready was furious. "You had no authority." McCready was saying his voice at the particular register that made younger ranch hands go quiet and still. "The Hutchins brothers' account was established by my father. I don't care that they're out of business. You don't reroute our supply accounts without my written approval, Bridger." "I rerouted nothing," Cole said. His voice was the same flat, even tone she'd come to know, but there was something underneath it now, a controlled tension like a rope pulled tight. "I opened a new account at a functioning supplier because our previous supplier ceased operations. That's within my authority as foreman." "Your authority as foreman is what I say it is," McCready said. "With respect, sir, the terms of my employment. Don't quote my own employment terms at me." McCready's voice went another degree colder. "I've been hearing other things too, Bridger. About how you've been spending your Thursday evenings." The room went very still. Maggie stepped forward from the warehouse doorway. "Mr. McCready?" Both men turned. McCready looked at her. His expression went through a rapid recalibration. He was a man of the old school, and he adjusted himself for a woman's presence even when he was angry, which she had always found both predictable and slightly contemptible. "Miss Calloway," he said. "This is my store," she said, "and this account." She moved behind the counter and opened the ledger to the McCready page without hesitation. "Is current accurate and was opened at the request of your foreman within the normal course of business operations. The terms are standard. The deposit was paid." She turned the ledger to face him. "If you have a dispute about your foreman's authority, that's a conversation between you and him. But the account itself is in order." McCready looked at the ledger, then at her, then back at the ledger. He was a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his displeasure. She could see him recalibrating again differently this time. "The account isn't the issue," he said, slightly deflated. "Then what you're discussing doesn't concern my store," she said pleasantly. "If you'd like to continue that conversation outside, I can give you both the privacy for it." A long silence. McCready put his hat on. "We'll discuss this at the ranch," he said to Cole. Not warmly, but differently than before. He walked out. The door closed. Cole stood at the counter looking at her. She closed the ledger and set it back in its place. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The account is in order," she said. "I wasn't going to stand in my own store and let someone imply otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment, with something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Something that wasn't. The almost smile wasn't the careful steadiness, wasn't the measured attention she'd come to expect. Something rawer than all of that. Something that had been pulled to the surface by what had just happened and wasn't quite all the way back down. "Maggie," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. "Not here," she said. "Not in the store." He nodded. "Once." The rawness went back behind the steadiness, but she could still see the outline of it. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. He left, and she stood at the counter with her hand flat on the closed ledger, and her heart doing that deliberate, aware-of-itself thing, and the afternoon light came through the front window, and the town went on outside, and Maggie stood in the middle of all of it, knowing with the same precision she gave everything else that something had just shifted past the point of return. She didn't know yet exactly what to do with that. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of finding out. Thursday came with a cold front that dropped the temperature 10 degrees overnight and put a thin skin of ice on the water trough outside the feed store that Maggie cracked with her boot heel at 6 in the morning without breaking stride. She had been thinking about Tuesday since Tuesday, about the way Cole's face had looked across the counter after McCready walked out that raw, unguarded thing that had surfaced for just a moment before he put it away. She'd told him, not here, not in the store, and he'd respected that without argument. And she'd spent the 2 days since wondering whether she'd been protecting herself or just delaying something she already knew was coming. Both, probably. She was honest with herself even when she didn't like what the honesty found. The morning was busy, in the way November mornings always were. The cold brought ranchers in earlier, wanting to confirm winter orders, wanting reassurance that their feed was accounted for. Maggie moved through it with the competence that had become so second nature she barely noticed it anymore. Figures, orders, accounts, deliveries. The rhythm of the store that she'd built herself, column by column, year by year. By 4 in the afternoon, the last customer had gone and the store was quiet. She balanced the day's accounts in 40 minutes, locked the ledger pulled on her coat. Cole was at the bend before she got there. He was standing the way he always stood, waiting, not pacing, not fidgeting, just present like a man who had made his peace with whatever was about to happen. She reached him. They started walking without preamble. "McCready?" she asked. "Sordid," he said. "He's not a bad man. He doesn't like surprises. I should have sent a written note about the account change before I acted on it. That's on me." "He came into my store," she said. "I know, and I'm sorry for it." "Don't be sorry," she said. "I handled it." "You did," he said. "More than handled it." He paused. "That's what I want to talk about, actually." She looked at him. "When you stepped out of that warehouse doorway," he said, "and you opened that ledger without hesitating. Maggie, I've worked with a lot of people, men who've been in business twice as long as you, and I have never seen someone command a room that quickly without raising their voice." She looked forward. "I know my own store." "It wasn't just the store," he said. "It was you. You walked in and the whole argument changed shape. McCready's a man who doesn't back down easily. He backed down. He recalibrated," she said. "There's a difference." "Call it what you want," Cole said. "I watched it happen, and I want you to know I saw it." She was quiet for a moment. "Why does it matter that you saw it?" she asked. He stopped walking. She took 2 steps and turned back. "Because you've been running that store for 6 years," he said. "And from what I can tell, most of the people in this town see you as a curiosity, something to talk about, something to have opinions about." His voice was even, but underneath it was that taut quality again, the controlled one. "I want you to know that I don't see you that way. I see what you actually are." "And what's that?" she said. "Someone who built something real," he said. "From nothing but her own 2 hands and her own mind. Someone who was never given the credit for it." He paused. "Someone who deserves better than what this town's been giving her." The cold came off the river, and she felt it against her face, and she stood there on the path with the November dark coming in early around them, and she felt with complete clarity that she was standing at the edge of something. She'd stood at edges before. She'd stood at the edge of the conversation with Thomas Greer and chosen honesty. She'd stood at the edge of the conversation with Robert Finch and chosen the same. She'd stood at the edge of this, whatever this was, with Cole Bridger for weeks now, managing the distance, measuring the approach. "Cole," she said. "Maggie, I need to tell you something." "Go ahead." "I am not easy," she said. "I know you've said that doesn't matter, but I need you to understand the specific way in which I'm not easy." She looked at him directly. "I will always do the accounts myself. I will always make the business decisions. If there is a problem in the store, I will fix it before I ask for help. Not because I'm proud." She stopped. "Actually, yes, partly because I'm proud. But mostly because this store is the thing I built, and the way I run it is the architecture of who I am. I won't be redesigned." He looked at her across the short, cold distance between them. "I know," he said. "You say that, Maggie." His voice was quiet and absolute. "I watched my mother run her store for 11 years, and I watched my father before her try to tell her how to do it, and I watched the damage that did to a woman who knew better than anyone in that building what she was doing." He held her gaze. "I am not my father, and I am not Thomas Greer or Robert Finch. I know the difference between a woman who needs help and a woman who has it handled, and I have never once looked at you and seen anything other than the second one." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it, weight and warmth both. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "We should keep walking," she said. "It's cold." "It is cold," he agreed. They walked. It was another 20 minutes before either of them spoke again, and in those 20 minutes, something settled between them that didn't need words to be real. The kind of settling that happened not in a moment, but across many moments, accumulated all the Thursdays and Saturdays and business conversations, all the almost smiles and the straight answers, and the way he'd moved that feed sack without making it a performance, the way he'd told her about Montana before she'd asked. All of it came together in those 20 minutes of cold river walking, and became something that was without question past the point where she could call it uncertain. She wasn't uncertain. She hadn't been for a while. She just needed to be sure she wasn't lying to herself. On the way back to town, he said, "Silver's ready to ride if you ever want to." She glanced at him. "The horse you mentioned." "Steadiest animal I've ever worked with," he said. "Doesn't spook, doesn't rush, goes exactly where you point her, and doesn't argue about it." He paused. "McCready said I could use the south pasture Saturday mornings. She hadn't ridden in 3 years. The last time had been a public humiliation that she did not think about if she could help it, a town picnic, a horse that had been poorly matched to a saddle, and half of Red Bluff watching her lose her seat in a way that had given Bill Harmon something to mention periodically for 2 years afterward. She hadn't been back on a horse since. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. He did not push. Saturday morning, she showed up at the south pasture gate at 8 o'clock. Cole was already there. He didn't say anything about the fact that she'd come. He just opened the gate. Silver was exactly what he'd said. Gray mare calm eyes, the particular quality of stillness that some horses had, and most didn't, not passivity, but settled confidence. The kind of animal that had been handled well and knew it. Maggie stood at the fence and looked at her. Cole stood nearby and said nothing. "You're not going to tell me she's gentle," Maggie said. "She's not particularly gentle," he said. "She's steady. Those are different things." She looked at him. "You knew about the picnic." He met her eyes without flinching. "I heard about it. Bill Harmon apparently found it very funny." "It wasn't funny," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. The horse was wrong for the saddle, and the saddle was wrong for me, and nobody said anything before I was already up," she said. "And then I came off and half the town watched and Bill Harmon laughed." She looked at Silver. "I decided I was done with horses." "That makes sense," Cole said. "Bad equipment and an audience. Worst possible combination." She was quiet for a moment. "What's different now?" she asked. "Right equipment," he said. "And I won't laugh." She looked at him for a long beat. Then she looked at Silver. She pushed off the fence and walked to the mare's side. Silver turned her head and regarded her with those calm, settled eyes. Maggie put her hand on the horse's neck, steady and warm. "All right," she said. Cole helped her up without ceremony, efficient, practical, a hand up and then back. No lingering assistance, no hovering. She settled into the saddle and felt the horse under her, the particular live weight of an animal that was paying attention and choosing patience. She sat there for a moment. The panic she'd half expected didn't come. Cole mounted his own horse in one easy motion, and they moved together into the pasture, and Maggie rode for the first time in 3 years, and Silver was exactly what he'd said, steady, responsive. Going where she was pointed without argument. They rode in silence for a while. It was cold and clear, and the pasture grass was winter brown, and the horses moved at an easy pace, and Maggie felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't known was tight. "This is good," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Don't make a thing of it," she said. "Wasn't going to," he said. She almost laughed. They rode until the cold got serious, and then walked the horses back to the gate. Cole dismounted and held Silver while Maggie came down, and when her boots hit the ground, she stood for a moment with her hand still on the saddle. "Same time next week," she said. "If you want," he said. "I want," she said. He nodded, took Silver's reins. And Maggie walked back toward town, feeling like something she'd abandoned in herself had just been returned, and she hadn't even known how much she'd missed it until it was back. The twist that she hadn't seen coming arrived on a Monday from an envelope. She almost missed it in the stack of correspondence it came between a supply invoice and a letter from her brother in Colorado that she set aside for later. Plain envelope, her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. No return address. Inside was a single folded page. She opened it at the counter. It was a letter. Short. Unsigned. And it told her something about Cole Bridger that stopped her breath for a full 3 seconds. The letter said he hadn't just left Montana because of Clara. The letter said that the spread outside Billings, the one he'd worked for 7 years, had let him go. That there had been a dispute about accounts. That money had gone missing from the operating fund, and Cole Bridger had been the man responsible for tracking it. The letter said he'd never been formally charged, but it said he'd left quietly without reference, and that the ranch owner up in Montana, a man named Hargreaves, had told people privately that he'd made a difficult decision not to pursue it because Cole had been with them a long time, and he hadn't wanted the trouble. Maggie read it twice. Then she set it on the counter and stood very still. The store was empty. It was mid-morning, and she was between customers, and the only sound was the wind against the front window and her own breathing. She looked at the letter. She was a woman who dealt in numbers, who dealt in accounts and ledgers and the precise tracking of where money went and where it came from. She understood better than most people in Red Bluff exactly what a missing operating fund meant, the deliberateness of it, the kind of person who would do it. She also understood something else. The letter was unsigned. She folded it and held it and thought about what she knew about Cole Bridger from her own direct observation. And then she thought about what an unsigned letter from an unknown sender was worth. And she did the math with the same precision she did everything. She went to the back room and got her coat. She walked to the McCready Ranch. It was 2 miles. She walked all of it straight up the main road in the November cold, and she did not slow down. Cole was in the far barn when the ranch hand found him and brought him out. He came through the barn door and saw her standing in the yard, and something in his face changed immediately. Not guilt she watched for guilt, but concern. The sharp, immediate kind. "Maggie," he said, "what's wrong?" She held out the letter. He took it, read it, and she watched his face. She watched it the way she watched figures in a ledger, looking for the discrepancy, the line that didn't add up. The tell. His expression went through something she hadn't seen before. Not guilt. Not the performance of innocence, which was different. Something harder than both of those. Something that looked like a man confronting a thing he'd hoped wouldn't find him here. He lowered the letter. "Where did this come from?" he said. "It arrived in my correspondence this morning," she said. "No return address." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it true?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Partly," he said. The word hit her like a cold front. "Tell me the part that's true," she said. "Money went missing from the Hargreaves operating fund," he said. "I was tracking it. Hargreaves blamed me. He didn't bring charges because he wasn't certain enough, and he wasn't certain enough because I wasn't responsible for it." His voice was level but not easy. "I know what that looks like. An unsigned letter and a man saying he didn't do it. I know exactly what it looks like." "Who did it?" she asked. "Hargreaves's nephew was managing the secondary accounts," he said. "I found the discrepancy, and I brought it to Hargreaves, and he chose not to believe me because it was his family. And then he let me go and told people he'd made a generous decision." His jaw tightened. "That's the version of the story that didn't get written down anywhere." She looked at him, at his face, at the way he was standing. "Who sent this letter?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I can make a reasonable guess." He paused. "Robert Finch bought the Whitmore property." She stared at him. "The Whitmore property borders McCready land on the North Road," he said. "Finch has been talking to people since he came back. I've heard it through the ranch hands. He's been asking questions about me specifically." His voice was flat and factual. "An unsigned letter designed to make you doubt me arriving after he showed up at your store. That's not coincidence, Maggie." She stood in the cold yard of the McCready Ranch with the wind coming down from the north, and she looked at Cole Bridger, and she thought about every conversation they'd had, every precise answer, every unflattering truth he'd told her before she asked. Montana. Clara. The leaving that was faster than it should have been. He hadn't hidden any of it. "You told me about Montana," she said slowly. "You told me about the leaving. You told me the unflattering version." "Yes," he said, "but you didn't tell me about the accounts." He met her eyes. "No," he said, "because I didn't want you of all people to hear something about missing money and have to decide what to believe. I was afraid of exactly this." He paused. "That was a mistake. I should have told you." The honesty of that hit her harder than the letter had. "Cole," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm asking you to believe." "Do you have anything?" she said. "Any record? Any documentation?" He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted a recognition of what she was actually asking. Not, do you have an excuse? Do you have evidence? Do you have the kind of thing she could verify? "I have letters," he said, "from two of the Hargreaves ranch hands. They wrote to me after I left. They knew what the nephew had done." He paused. "I kept them. They're at the ranch house." "I want to read them," she said. He looked at her for one long beat. "Come with me," he said. They walked to the ranch house together, and he went inside and came back with two folded letters worn at the creases, the kind of letters that had been read and refolded many times. She sat at the porch step in the cold and read them both carefully, the way she read everything, looking for the specific, the verifiable, the detail that held together under examination. They held together. She folded them and held them in her lap for a moment. "Robert Finch wants you to doubt me," Cole said quietly from where he stood nearby. "He wants you to find this and ask me about it and decide I'm not worth the trouble." "I know that," she said. "Does it change anything?" he asked. She looked up at him, handed the letters back. "Someone went to a lot of trouble," she said, "to make me walk away from you." "Yes," he said. "That tells me something," she said. He waited. "It tells me they were worried about what we are," she said, "and people don't worry about things that don't matter." The almost smile appeared, slowly. The deepened line, the barely there shift. But it went deeper this time than she'd ever seen it go. "Maggie Calloway," he said. "Don't make it soft," she said, standing up. "I'm still going to watch. I'm still going to pay attention. That doesn't stop." "I know," he said. "And if you ever have something uncomfortable to tell me," she said, "you tell me before someone else does. That's the only rule that matters." "Understood," he said. She looked at him one more moment. Then she turned and started back down the road toward town, back toward the store and the ledger, and the life she'd built without anyone's help, walking the same way she always walked, straight spine, head up, eyes forward. Cole watched her go, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Red Bluff, Texas, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. She didn't tell anyone about the letter, not because she was hiding it, because it wasn't anyone else's business. It was a thing that had happened between her and Cole, and they had handled it together. And as far as Maggie Calloway was concerned, that was where it stayed. She went back to the store. She opened the ledger. She worked the afternoon accounts with the same precision she always did. And when the figures balanced, she closed the book and sat for a moment in the lamplight and thought about what she'd said to him on the McCready porch. People don't worry about things that don't matter. She'd meant it as an observation, as logic. But sitting in the quiet of the store afterward, she understood it was also a declaration. She'd just told Cole Bridger, in the only language she fully trusted, that he mattered. That whatever they were building was real enough that someone had thought it worth destroying. She wasn't angry at Robert Finch. She'd moved past anger into something colder and more useful clarity. Robert Finch was a man who had walked away from something he didn't appreciate until someone else saw its value. That was his failure, not hers, and she wasn't going to spend another hour of her life letting his failures shape her choices. She turned the lamp down and went to bed. December arrived the way December did in that part of Texas, not gently. The cold settled in and meant it, and the wind off the open range had an edge that made even the hardened ranch hands move a little faster between buildings. Maggie added a second lamp to the store counter and kept the backroom stove burning through working hours, and the feed store became, in the way it always did in winter, one of the warmer places on the main street. People lingered longer than they needed to. She didn't mind. She'd always understood that a business was also a place, and a place had to be worth coming to. Cole came in on a Tuesday with a question about the McCready December order, and they stood at the counter for 40 minutes going over the winter figures. It was the same as every other account conversation they'd had, precise, practical, efficient. Except that now, when he looked up from the ledger, his eyes met hers with something that wasn't just professional attention, and she met them back the same way. And neither of them made anything of it out loud, because they were in the store, and the front window faced the street. When he was done, he picked up his copy of the order sheet and said, "Saturday morning, South Pasture." 7:30, she said. 7:30, he agreed, and left. Martha Hensley, who had not stopped watching, happened to be across the street. Maggie watched her watch Cole walk away. Then she went back to the accounts. The Saturday rides had become a fixed thing without either of them formally naming them as such. 4 weeks into them, Maggie had progressed from Silver's easy walk to a confident trot across the South Pasture, and the particular freedom of it, the cold air and the open ground and the animal moving beneath her with that steady, reliable power, had become something she looked forward to, with a directness she no longer tried to manage. She'd spent 6 years managing what she let herself want. She was tired of it. On the fourth Saturday, Cole brought 2 cups of coffee in a tin pail, which was not a romantic gesture so much as a practical one. It was 30 degrees, and they were riding in it, and coffee was sensible. But when they stopped at the far fence line, and she wrapped both hands around the cup, and the warmth came through, and she looked out over the winter pasture, and felt in her entire body the particular rightness of being exactly where she was, she understood that practical and meaningful were not mutually exclusive. Sometimes the most meaningful things were the ones that just made sense. "Cole," she said. "Maggie." "I'm not going to say something significant," she said. "I just wanted to say your name." He looked at her. The almost smile went all the way, this time quiet, real, unhurried, the kind that reached his eyes properly and stayed there. "All right," he said. They drank their coffee. The shift in the town happened, the way most real shifts happened, not in a moment, but across many small ones, so gradually that by the time you noticed it, it had already been true for a while. Bill Harmon stopped making comments. Not loudly, not ceremonially, he just stopped. One Thursday, Maggie walked past the livery, and he nodded at her from the doorway, the same way he'd nod at anyone, and that was that. Martha Hensley still watched, but the watching had changed quality. It was less like surveillance and more like attention. The difference was subtle, but Maggie felt it. The Delgado family, who had opened their account in October, started sending their eldest daughter in on Saturdays, and the daughter, 16, sharp-eyed, quick with numbers, would sometimes sit at the corner of the counter while Maggie worked through the week's reconciliation. Maggie didn't invite it. She also didn't discourage it. She just worked, and the girl watched, and once when Maggie caught an addition error in a supplier invoice without pause, the girl said quietly, "How did you do that so fast?" And Maggie said, "Practice. You want me to show you how the columns work?" And the girl said yes. That was a Tuesday. By the following Tuesday, the girl was back. Maggie thought about that sometimes. About what it meant to be seen doing a thing well. Not praised for it, not celebrated, just seen. Witnessed by someone who was paying real attention. She thought about how rarely that had happened to her in 6 years, and how much it had cost her quietly in ways she hadn't fully named. Cole saw her. He had from the beginning. She thought about that too. The second twist came not from an envelope this time, but from Gerald McCready himself on a Wednesday afternoon when he walked into the feed store alone without Cole and stood at the counter with his hat in his hands in the way that large, certain men stood when they were about to say something they found uncomfortable. Maggie set down her pencil. "Mr. McCready," she said. "Miss Calloway." He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." She waited. "I came into your store last month in a temper, and I implied your account records were in question," he said. "They were not in question. Your records are impeccable. I was wrong to suggest otherwise, and I'm sorry for it." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that." He shifted his weight. "I also owe Bridger one, and I've given it." He paused. "He's a good foreman, best I've had. I let my temper get ahead of my judgment." Another pause, longer this time. "He's a good man. I expect you know that." "I do," she said. McCready nodded once firmly, the gesture of a man closing an account. "Good day, Miss Calloway." "Good day, Mr. McCready." He left. She stood at the counter for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. But there was something warm in the air of the store that hadn't been there before. The particular warmth of a thing being made right. Cole came in that Friday, and she told him about the visit, and he listened without expression until she was done. "He told me he spoke to you," he said. "He did." "He's not a bad man," Cole said, the same thing he'd said before. "No," she agreed. "He's not." She looked at him. "Neither are you." He held her gaze. "Maggie." "I know," she said. "I said it. Don't make it awkward." The full smile. Rare, and because it was rare, worth more than a dozen easy ones. She looked down at the ledger so he wouldn't see that she was smiling too. The conversation that changed the shape of everything happened on a Thursday evening in the third week of December, in the cold by the river, in the particular quiet that comes after the wind has passed, and before it starts again. They had walked the full length of their usual path and turned back and were nearly at the bend when Cole stopped. She stopped with him. He turned to face her. Not the careful, measured version of himself that he wore in public. The full version. The one she'd seen briefly on the McCready porch and on the fence line with the coffee cups, and in a dozen small moments that she'd catalogued with the same precision she gave everything. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask?" she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not because it's expected. Not because the town's watching or because it would make things simpler. Because I mean it, and I want you to know I mean it." He held her gaze with those steady dark eyes. "Maggie Calloway, you are the most clear-minded, capable, straight-dealing person I have ever known, and I have not once wanted you to be different than you are, not once." He paused. "Would you marry me?" The river went on behind him. The cold was real and immediate, and she felt it in her lungs and her hands, and she stood in it and looked at Cole Bridger and did what she always did. She looked at the numbers. All of them. Every conversation, every walk, every unflattering truth offered without being asked. The coffee on the fence line. The way he'd moved the feed sack. The letters from Montana he'd shown her without hesitation. The way he'd said, "I'm counting on it." The figures balanced. They always balanced when she did the math honestly. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. A breath he'd been holding, she realized, longer than just this conversation. "Yes," she said again because it was worth saying twice. He reached out and took her hand and she let him, and they stood at the river bend in the December cold, with the town of Red Bluff behind them, and its opinions, and its watching, and its years of commentary about what Maggie Calloway was and wasn't. and none of it touched them. Not here. Not now. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it," he said immediately. "The accounts stay mine," she said. "The store accounts, the McCready accounts, if I keep them, any accounts that come through my books. That doesn't change." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. "I mean it," she said. "So do I," he said. "Maggie, I have watched you work. I would no more touch those accounts than I would try to tell the river which way to run." She looked at him for a beat. Then she looked down at their joined hands, and then back up. "All right," she said. "Then yes. Completely yes." They walked back to town, holding hands in the cold dark, and nobody saw them, and it didn't matter whether anyone did or not. They married in February on a Saturday morning in the Red Bluff church, with the winter light coming through the plain windows and the pews holding a congregation that was, to Maggie's private amusement, considerably fuller than she'd expected. The Delgado family came. Frank Pruitt from the hardware store came. The young Delgado daughter sat in the third row and watched with those sharp eyes, and Maggie caught her gaze for a moment from the front of the church and nodded once the way you nodded at someone who was paying real attention. Gerald McCready came and sat in the back and held his hat in his hands throughout. Bill Harmon came. He did not make a single comment before, during, or after, which was perhaps the most significant thing he'd done in Maggie's presence in 6 years. Martha Hensley came and cried, which surprised everyone, including Martha. Cole stood at the front of the church with the same stillness he carried everywhere, unhurried, present entirely himself. When Maggie walked toward him, he watched her the way he always watched her, like she was exactly what he'd expected, and more than he could have said, and she walked to him, the way she walked everywhere, spine straight, head up, no apology in any part of her. They said what needed to be said. The minister was brief, which she appreciated. Afterward, outside the church, in the February cold, with the town milling around them, and someone's dog having gotten loose, and the general pleasant chaos of a community event, Cole leaned close and said quietly, "How are the accounts looking?" She looked at him. He was entirely serious. "McCready's January order came in $3 under projection," she said. "I'll adjust the February estimate accordingly." "Good," he said. "I thought so," she said, and she took his arm, and they walked through Red Bluff, Texas in the winter light, and the town watched them go. And what the town saw was not a woman who had finally been claimed, or a man who had finally tamed something difficult. What the town saw, what anyone with eyes and any sense saw, was two people who had found, after long and separate roads, someone who met them exactly where they stood. Maggie Bridger went home that evening and opened the ledger and entered the month's final figures and drew the line under them in her precise, unhurried hand. The columns balanced. They always did. And for the first time in 6 years, when she closed the book and turned down the lamp, the silence in the back room of the Callaway feed store felt not like the quiet of a woman alone, but like the quiet of a woman who had everything she needed and had known all along exactly what that was worth.